One, two, three. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Chalkboard History. Jacob Dolson Cox.
Jacob Dolson Cox.
As the professor used to say, he always says everybody's name. George Day Wagner.
No,
Jacob
I gotta
Dolson
use
Cox.
the whole name. The whole name. We are on a run of citizen soldiers. We've done a whole series of guys that didn't actually go to West Point.
Oh, they're way more cool anyways.
Yeah.
West Point guys are often stodgy and boring. They're like academic historians, you know. They're like, well, I know so much. I'm the West. I was an instructor at West Point. So yes, Jacob Cox, citizen soldier, abolitionist.
Abolitionist,
Oh,
yeah.
yes, he was straight out of the heart of Oberlin College.
Yeah, which was radically
it's the
liberal for its time
the
period.
Berkeley of its time.
They're admitting black students, and oh my gosh,
how dare they?
Even more scandalous than that, they're admitting women.
Well,
it's crazy town
I know.
up there.
What were they thinking?
I know.
I told a group yesterday, well, y'all were supposed to stay home. You're not even supposed to have a job, right? That's how. And I was telling this in the context of if we were white males at the time, that's of course
That's
what
you
we
thought.
Yeah, you can't vote.
Half the women thought that too.
You can't vote. Stay home. Go cook something.
You know, the interesting thing about him, though, is as radical as he is about abolition, post-war, he's not real big on black citizenship. He runs afoul of the radical Republicans because he's not necessarily, and he thinks segregation's okay, so he's in complex.
This is an interesting topic that we should cover in another one, but I find this is more and more you see that so many abolitionists are they're kind of like lukewarm abolitionists.
Okay.
They think it's a great idea till the black guy moves into their neighborhood. I think it's interesting that Jay is telling me I have to move closer to my microphone. I think it's interesting that a lot of these abolitionists really are almost like lukewarm on real civil rights. It's really cool till a black person moves into their neighborhood.
Yeah.
And
so as long as you're delegating to somebody else what they should do in, say, Mississippi, but
Right.
not necessarily when it comes home.
And I think sometimes the guy who wasn't the abolitionist were the ones who sort of came around to equality even before some of the people who sat up in the glass houses.
That's an interesting point. Cause
like Lincoln, who's
yeah.
not a bona fide abolitionist, but I think he begins to see that he has to rethink this whole idea of who people really are and that skin tone isn't the decider.
Mm-hmm. There was a lady on my slavery tour yesterday from Indiana, and she said, I've never understood why racism is so bad in Indiana where slavery never existed. And she said, why? And she said, we have one of the most active chapters of the Ku Klux Klan. It's been such a big place for that. And I said, well, I think part of it is that. I mean, they never lived among people of color, and so there's a suspicion. She said there's still no person of color in my hometown in Indiana, so I think there is.
And Cox is a product of that environment, and I'm really referring sometimes to the difference in cities and rural areas. Cox is very much immersed in the sort of progressive ideas of the cities on the issues of race. Well, when you get right down to it, what's happening in rural Ohio or rural Indiana?
Yeah,
what's the sentiment out there? So tell us a little bit about Mr. Jacob
Well,
Cox.
he's born in Canada. His father's up there working construction or something. He's born in Montreal, but he grows up in Ohio, educated, goes to school, thinks he wants to be a minister. By the time he's all done with college, has changed his mind about that, gets a law degree, serves a term in the Ohio Senate. He's a school superintendent, but he sees that war is on the horizon. And so he begins to read military treaties. I mean, he's not formally educated, but he's doing a little research just in case. And he gets an early commission in the Army. And there were a lot of those political commissions that turned out to be disastrous. I mean, horrible people in those positions. But he actually turns out to be a pretty effective commander. Initially serving in the East, right? Army of the Potomac. He's at
7th Ohio, I think, is the unit he was in, right? Was it 7th Ohio?
I don't remember for sure.
Well, I know he was connected. He knew Mervyn Clark, who they later crossed paths at Franklin, because Clark was in the 7th Ohio. And anyways, but yes, in the East, and he saw, so much of the action that we know today, particularly Antietam.
Yeah, he's fighting under McClellan there, and he's got a couple of his subordinates turn out to be presidents. Rutherford B. Hayes, McKinley, I think's there too. But he earns his spurs there and performs admirably.
Right.
And then he's given a desk job for a bit, right, in the District of Ohio. So he leaves the field for a bit, and when he comes back,
right,
he's in the West.
Right, and he's in the 23rd Corps, and so they end up around Knoxville. They're up there for a good part of 1863. But his career, his place in history was cemented really at the Battle of Franklin. And that's probably what we should focus on, because Cox is, of course, he's a division commander. And he and, the other commanders in the Army, George Wagner, T.J. Wood, Nathan Kimball, they're all part of the Great Escape. They slip away from the Confederates. They march from Columbia right past Rippavilla. They're headed north toward Franklin. But Cox arrived, so his division's in the lead.
Right.
And he and John Schofield arrived at the Carter House just before sunrise on November 30th, 1864. And we talk about him every day because he was there. He set up headquarters, and Schofield knew that he had a problem, but pretty quickly he figured out he had a problem, which was he couldn't get the army across the river. And so then what happens? Back?
So while Schofield, he's going to be taking care of the bridge construction, and so he comes back and tells Jacob Cox, we're going to have to fortify here. And so he gives him instructions on how to place the army, and then kind of turns it over to him, and he goes back to see about the bridges, and Jacob Cox is going to start placing those guys on the line.
Right. So eventually Cox's division, Thomas Ruger's division, and Nathan Kimball's division form the bulk of the Federal defensive line. But there's the inevitable, so there's the battle, but then there's the inevitable controversy that unfolds afterwards. And the controversy really goes on for several decades. And much of it focuses on George Wagner and his decisions, and then Emerson Updike and Cox, who were long friends, just battle it out in letters that go back and forth, because Cox is already working on a, pretty rudimentary history of the battle. And then after Updike's death, so Wagner's gone, Updike's gone, and Cox decides he's going to write a book on the Battle of Franklin. And it's called Battle of Franklin, a monograph. And I first encountered it, I know, in the late 1980s. It remains the best book, in my opinion, written by a participant.
First-hand account,
Because Cox was not just there. And he's a pretty good writer. He was a very good researcher and kind of early historian of the battle. I mean, he really did his homework.
He comes back and talks to Moscow Carter, doesn't he?
He does he does at one point. I think the most interesting thing that has come out of Cox's writings, and both Joseph and I dabbled around with this as we were trying to figure out if we should write about Wagner, is what really went on. And I know there's some people out there who want to give Cox all the credit, or they want to throw all the blame on George Wagner. And I think over time it's, Cox helped save the U.S. Army. His solid disposition of the troops and his leadership there's no doubt about that. Cox conveniently skates, though, when it comes to Wagner. And this comes down to these weird, this is what Civil War military nerds sit and talk about. So Cox is a 23rd Corps guy. He has command of the main line. Wagner's a 4th Corps guy. His commander, David Stanley, was sick and hanging out with Schofield back toward the river. Cox told Wagner that he should pull back from the advanced line if he was too severely pressed. Well, anybody who's followed the battle knows that Wagner was obviously very severely pressed,
right?
And he didn't pull back. And Cox just did everything imaginable to distance himself from any responsibility. And I've always found that to be very odd, because Nathan Kimball, who was on the right wing of the main line, was a 4th Corps guy, and Cox didn't have any issue directly telling him what to do. But when it came to Wagner, he didn't. And I think Cox got caught off guard like everybody else and conveniently just washed his hands of it, because Wagner had made a mistake. Wagner knew it because Wagner's in Nashville the day after the battle telling Cox what went on. And I think Cox was initially disposed to believe Wagner, who wasn't lying. Wagner just wasn't explaining everything fully.
Completely, yeah.
So it's a lie by omission. But he conveniently gets away. The last thing about Cox, which is so fascinating, is he was the person early on who knew that Emerson Updike had not saved the day. Because he and Updike went round and round about this. And really, sadly, although had the story been told, I think, more accurately, I wouldn't have written my last book. Updike ended up winning the day because his version somehow got out on top, which is not what Jacob Cox says in the book. He clearly talks about how there were other troops, secondary line troops, that were involved. And so, more than anything, his role is so key, but his understanding and interpretation of the battle helped craft really the earliest, like, post-veteran interpretation, how people viewed it. And I'm pretty happy to say that our work, we, I think, tell a more balanced and fact-based account of what happened that day. You know, which plays out only in a few hours. So what are your thoughts about Mr. Cox as someone who gives tours of Carter House?
Well, I think he's interesting in his role that he plays there, but I think he's also interesting in who he becomes after the war. I mean, he goes on to East Governor of Ohio. And one of the cool things he did, 1866, he becomes concerned because he hears that the Federal soldiers who died at Franklin are still lying there in their temporary graves, and he has concern about them, wants to make sure. He reaches out to George Henry Thomas, who's overseeing the District of Tennessee. Thomas assures him efforts are being made. There was actually an effort to create a national cemetery, and Franklin wasn't keen on that idea.
Yes.
And so they end up at Columbia, buried next to Confederates, which also doesn't go over very well, and they get moved a second time to Stones River. But then Jacob Cox gets tapped by Ulysses S. Grant, who becomes Secretary of the Interior. Does some good things early on as far as Indian relations and civil service, and then he and Grant come to loggerheads, and I think he steps away from that position at that point.
Why?
I don't remember. I don't know what it is that they're disagreeing about. But at some point, he doesn't complete his first. He's not there for the first term. He steps away.
Well, he is interesting in the big scheme of Franklin's history. Jacob Cox probably understood as well as any participant how important it was, and not just important to him. When he wrote his book, although I think he's very proud of his service and what he did that day, that book is not about him. It is about the battle. And I can't stress enough, I mean, I used it over and over again when I worked on my first book, and getting an understanding of how the Federal Army established its position that morning and what its intent was, and when the battle unfolded, you know, how things played out and what his role was. I have long believed that when the battle was over and the U.S. troops began to pull out, that it was Jacob Cox or somebody on his staff, because his brother was on his staff, Theodore, that it was probably one of them that told the Carters they could come out of the basement. I mean, it would make sense because he's one of the last line officers. There was an account, last thing, I was thinking about an account that was published in his book, and it was a guy named Tristram Dow, who I think was from the 112th Illinois, but he was either temporarily attached to Cox or maybe he was on his staff. Dow said that as they were beginning to withdraw, he walked south on Columbia Pike, and the sights that and the sounds that he heard, because it was dark, but you know, your eyes will adjust enough that you can see things in relative proximity, but the sounds, and it was just awful. And Cox wanted to stay and finish the Confederates off in the morning. Levi Schofield, no relation to the commander, wrote a letter to Cox. And Rich Rupp and I, who worked on both my first and third book, we went through all of Cox's papers, which are at Oberlin. And this Levi Schofield letter said the Battle of Nashville was fought at Franklin, Tennessee, which was really telling about how damaged the Confederates were, and largely through the efforts of Jacob Cox. Any last thoughts on Mr. Jacob Cox?
He's an interesting fellow, yeah.
We
have his desk, which I think is really cool. His field desk on loan at Carter House. That's always cool.
And some of his descendants have been very supportive of what we're doing, and how we simply tell his story.
Yeah.
It still gets me every time I give a tour that Fountain Branch Carter and Moscow Carter came very likely in that parlor to ask Jacob Cox if they should leave. Mm-hmm. And he told them he didn't think there was going to be a battle. Mm-hmm. Of course there was, but what a just a couple of moments in the middle of a hectic day that would turn into terrible bloodshed. So come take a tour, and learn about Jacob Cox, and learn about what was a little bit of the inside story about what was happening before the Battle of Franklin. Thanks, everybody.